Intense negotiations for a new world farm trade deal got underway this past week in Geneva, Switzerland. Alanna Koch, president of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, is optimistic a new deal can be reached in the next few months. And Ms. Koch joins us from Regina. Welcome to FarmGate.
Good afternoon, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Right off the top then, can you tell our audience what the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance is all about and how it's connected to the World Trade Organization talks?
Sure. Well, Cafta, the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, is a national association of organizations, businesses that are all involved in agri-food exports. The reason for our existence is solely for advocacy of trade liberalization for the agri-food industry. We are focused primarily on multilateral trade talks, and of course that would be our linkage to the World Trade Organization negotiations that are going on right now in Geneva.
So are you confident that a new deal for agriculture will be drawn up in this latest WTO round?
Yes, I'm quite confident. I have been going to Geneva over the last, 2 years, and while these talks have begun and stalled and started and lurched forward, right now it certainly looks like there is a lot of momentum in Geneva. I just came back on Saturday. There was a public forum there last week in Geneva, and negotiations began again this week and will continue next week with respect to agriculture, and there's a great deal of optimism in the air. Not saying that there aren't challenges ahead, because there certainly are, but certainly I'm quite confident that we are going to get a deal at the end of all of this.
Now, your organization is also calling on the Canadian government to support more liberalized farm trade. Can you give some examples of why you think the government is failing in this area?
Well, Canada has always had a rather odd negotiating position. Despite the fact that we're the world's fourth largest agri-food exporter, Canada has always taken what it calls a balanced negotiating position at the trade talks. 90% of Canadian farmers are dependent on exports, but 10% are in what are protected industries. And the Canadian government has always taken this position forward that we need to be concerned about our defensive interests and at the same time be sort of talking out of both sides of our mouth as far as also being interested in exports. What we want as exporters in the agriculture industry is for the Canadian government to remember, first of all, that it does have a balanced position, that we don't really like that balanced position, but that for certain they must be speaking on behalf of agri-food exporters. In the past couple of weeks, it would seem as if the government has been solely focused on our defensive or protectionist interests of the Canadian agriculture industry. That's of alarm and great concern to all of the agri-food exporters in the Canadian agriculture industry, because we're just so dependent on trade. Canada, in fact, is the most trade-dependent developed nation in the world. Saskatchewan, for example, 97% of Saskatchewan agriculture is dependent on trade. This is of primary importance to all Canadian farmers, but certainly for Saskatchewan farmers.
So I guess you say it's not possible to support both farm supply management and liberalized trade in the WTO arena.
Well, I mean, that's up to the Canadian government to determine how they're going to represent both interests as far as the Canadian agriculture industry is concerned. What we're saying is what you need to remember as a government is that 90% of us depend on trade, and that must be taken into consideration and be a realistic fact as they move forward and try to push for an ambitious deal, that they need to remember that Canada is a trade-dependent country. It's up to the Canadian government to determine how they maneuver that, but that they need to remember that the large majority of Canadian agriculture is dependent on trade and international markets.
How much of a factor is the Canadian Wheat Board and single desk marketing in the WTO negotiations on agriculture?
Well, the Canadian Wheat Board monopoly is certainly on the table with respect to trade distortion. So it's part of the export competition pillar. There's 3 pillars as part of the agriculture negotiations: domestic support, export competition, and market access. So when discussions talk about the Canadian Wheat Board monopoly, it's with respect to the export competition pillar. We already know that if there's a deal, the Canadian Wheat Board will need to adjust the way it does business with respect to its government guarantees, the ability to access government board levels, those kinds of things. We know that that's already going to have to be adjusted. The issue that is still unclear is to the monopoly, and some countries, particularly the Americans and the Europeans, are saying that the monopoly must be addressed overall. Canada's position is that the trade distorting component of the monopoly will be addressed if necessary. Cafta's perspective is that the trade distortion is what needs to be addressed, and that certainly has been our position in the past and will continue to be moving forward.
This past week, the U.S. claimed its farm subsidy levels fall within the rules of the WTO. What's your assessment of that statement made by the chief U.S. farm trade negotiator?
Well, of course, negotiators and governments obviously take positions that are of the most benefit to them as we go through these negotiations. I guess it's fair to say that that is the numbers that they've put forward. There's a lot of analysis going into that right now. The Canadian government does have a position that is being challenged right now at the WTO with respect to dispute resolution, challenging American support levels, and our view would be this is exactly the reason why we need to see an ambitious result to the WTO negotiations, is to ensure that the subsidy levels are reduced, that we see less distortion in the international marketplace, and that we have strong rules and dispute resolution to ensure that countries can't break rules if in fact they are.
It's going to be hard, though, for countries to find common ground in negotiations if there's no agreement on what constitutes a trade-distorting subsidy.
Well, of course, that's one of the reasons why this is such a challenging negotiation, is because agriculture is a very, very tough nut to crack. But this round, the Doha round of the WTO, is the round that needs to do that. It's the first round that's actually going to address agriculture subsidies, see a little bit more sanity come into agricultural international markets, and it's absolutely vital that we do see some agreement. And we've seen what international deals can do for tariff levels. We've seen industrial tariffs over decades of negotiation come down to an average of 4%. Agriculture subsidies, tariff levels are still at 60%, and that's just unacceptable. And that's why we need to see an ambitious result, is to ensure that we see more sanity in agriculture trade. It's not going to be perfect, but it must be better than what we have right now.
How long before we might see some progress at this latest round of talks?
Well, there are 2 very intensive weeks going on right now, and they're discussing market access for agriculture. Then everyone's going home to capitals to discuss where we go from here. I think we'll see a new text early November. Then that text comes back for agriculture, and I think then that will dovetail with the non-agriculture market access text, as well as services and rules. I think by the end of the year we will see a ministerial meeting, and hopefully by early New Year we'll have something that will turn into a final deal.
Well, thanks again, Alanna, for taking time to come on FarmGate. Your insights were very much appreciated.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
We'll break again for commercials, but stay with us. We're back in 2 minutes.